Short answer, because the crews of the early steamships thought that they jammed up the seaways and harbours. Windjammer is not a term for a specific ship type, but a derogatory slur originally used by steamship crews about their sailing ship competitors. Sailing ships have right of way before engine ships, and back then had a harder time entering port, which gave rise to the notion that wind-propelled ships jammed up the traffic. Like most slurs, windjammer was later changed to have the meaning that the very large late sailing ships had such large sail areas that they jammed the wind itself, a notion established by proponents of sails. Windjammer became a term used for all the very large sailing ships that competed with steamships and later engine ships. It is an irony of fate that the windjammers ended up lasting more or less as long as steamships in commercial use, both being replaced by motorships with diesel engines. The grouping of large sailing ships that came to be called windjammers would benefit from many of the same technological advances as their steamship competitors. Thus windjammers would start to be constructed with steel hulls and masts, and the rigging would become mechanized to save manpower. Ironically, the mechanical rigging would be run by a small steam engine and later diesel engine. In America, extremely large wooden ships would be built into the 20th century, with the Wyoming being the largest known wooden hull ever built. The Wyoming would be schooner-rigged with 6 masts. It suffered from deformation of the hull due to its size and the limits of the wood, meaning it had to use pumps to drain water that seeped in. Schooner rigging on multi-masted American windjammers was common, as this rigging was well suited for rounding the Cape Horn to get from the east to the west coast before the Panama Canal. Schooner rigging was also used on the Thomas W. Lawson, which was the only 7-masted ship ever built and the largest pure sailing ship ever. Unlike the Wyoming, it had steel hull. Wyoming was launched in 1901 and the Thomas W. Lawson in 1902. Windjammers could be rigged as schooners, barkentines, barks, and fully rigged ships. The rigging chosen was dependent on the condition of their sailing routes. As stated, American windjammers would more often be schooner-rigged than European ones due to the routes that they would be used on. Long-haul European routes would more often favor bark or full rigging. The windjammers could long compete with steamships on long routes due to the fuel limits of steamships. The largest full-rigged ship to be built was the 5-masted German windjammer Preußen in 1902. She was the only 5-masted full-rigged ship ever built until the Royal Clipper in the year 2000. Preußen was a successful cargo ship sailing saltpeter from Peru to Hamburg, Germany. In keeping with the evolution in sail ship construction of the time, both her masts and hull was made of steel. She successfully completed 12 voyages on the route between Peru and Germany. Herein lay the strength of the late large windjammer sailing ships. They were capable of long-haul bulk cargo journeys on routes that were difficult for steamships to refuel on. Steamships were dependent on coal and fresh water to sail and needed to bunker both along their journeys. So they could only sail on routes that they could make on a single bunkering, or bunkering harbours needed to be established along the way. Thus a very large logistic network needed to be established for steamships to compete with windjammers. The steamships were helped greatly by the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, but on many routes, sailing ships were still cost-effective. The windjammers were competitive on large bulk cargo of low cost, like wheat, saltpeter, coal, and the like. Not only on long trips were windjammers cost competitive with steamships, they could also compete on crew cost. The mechanical rigging had greatly reduced the crew needed for large sailing ships to a degree where late windjammers often had smaller crews than steamships. This was especially important with low-value long-haul cargo, and thus the windjammers, despite the ire of steamship crews, became the first ships to transport base goods from one end of the globe to the other even outside the main shipping routes that were being taken over by steamships and motorships. The great weakness of windjammers as compared to steamships, and even more so engine ships, was that they could not keep a schedule as well. They were more at the mercy of the wind and currents. Even as they got auxiliary engines, especially with the advent of diesel engines, this only made up for the limits of the start and end of the journey when going to port or at especially challenging parts of the voyage. It could not be used continuously. This is why long-haul low-value bulk cargo became the main use of the windjammers, as the schedule was not quite as important with these goods. But in the end, the greater ability of engine ships to scale up in size and the improved logistics system pushed the windjammers out. Even so, the windjammers still remain as cruise ships like the Royal Clipper and as training ships.